My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 41 years old, and 20 years ago, my grandmother walked away from our family farm in rural Tennessee without a single word of explanation. She left behind 3 generations of confused, angry relatives and a legacy that seemed to crumble the moment she disappeared. We told ourselves stories to fill the silence. Some said she'd lost her mind. Others whispered about a secret lover or hidden debts. My father, her only son, stopped speaking her name altogether, as if erasing her from our vocabulary could erase the abandonment. But I never stopped wondering. I never stopped feeling the ghost of her presence in the barn, where she taught me to bottle preserves, in the fields where we walked at dawn, in the kitchen where her laughter used to fill every corner like warm honey. Then, 3 weeks ago, she came back. No warning, no apology, just a phone call to my father from a number none of us recognized. Her voice, he said later, sounded exactly the same, as if 2 decades had been nothing more than a long afternoon. She wanted to have dinner. She wanted to see the family. She wanted, she said carefully, to set something right. What we didn't know, what none of us could have possibly imagined, was that the farm we thought we knew had been hiding a truth so explosive it would shatter everything we believed about our family, our history, and the woman we thought had simply given up on us. The Mitchell family farm sits on 200 acres of rolling Tennessee hills, land that's been in our blood for 4 generations. My great-great-grandfather cleared the first fields with nothing but an axe and a mule, built the original farmhouse from timber he cut himself, and planted the apple orchard that still produces fruit every fall. Growing up, I believed that land was as permanent as the mountains on the horizon, as unchangeable as the seasons. I believed my grandmother, Ruth Mitchell, was the heart that kept it all beating. She was the one who knew every inch of soil, every quirk of weather, every secret the land whispered to those patient enough to listen. When I was young, she'd take me walking through the orchards at sunrise, her calloused hand wrapped around mine, teaching me the names of birds and the patterns of clouds that meant rain was coming. She never talked much about feelings or abstract things. Her love was practical, expressed through jars of pickles she'd leave on our porch, through the way she'd fix a broken fence before anyone noticed it needed mending, through her presence at every birthday and holiday, solid and dependable as the barn itself. Then I turned 21, and she vanished. It was early October, just after the apple harvest. I remember because I'd helped her that week, climbing ladders and filling bushel baskets until my arms ached. She seemed normal, maybe a little quieter than usual, but I attributed that to age. She was 73 then, still strong but starting to slow down in small, barely noticeable ways. The morning she left, she made breakfast for my grandfather, kissed his forehead, told him she had errands in town, and drove away in her old pickup truck. She never came back to the farmhouse. Instead, she went to the bank, withdrew a significant amount of cash, left the truck in the grocery store parking lot with the keys in the ignition, and disappeared. The note she left was brief and maddeningly vague, written on the back of a feed store receipt and tucked under the truck's sun visor. It said only this: I have to find what was taken. Don't look for me. I'll come back when it's time. My grandfather found the note 2 days later, when the sheriff located the abandoned truck. By then, Grandma Ruth was gone, truly and completely gone, as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed her whole. The family fractured in her absence. My grandfather, a man who'd never been particularly expressive, retreated into a silence so deep it felt like drowning. He continued working the farm with mechanical precision, but the life had gone out of him. He died 4 years later, and I've always believed it was heartbreak that killed him, not the heart attack the doctors listed on the death certificate. My father inherited the farm and the bitterness that came with it. He couldn't forgive her for leaving, couldn't understand how a woman could walk away from everything and everyone she'd supposedly loved. He threw himself into modernizing the operation, tearing down old structures and putting up new ones, as if he could physically erase her memory from the landscape. My uncle, Dad's younger brother, took a different path. He left Tennessee altogether, moved to Colorado, and refused to come back even for holidays. He said the farm felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the absence of the one person who'd made it feel like home. My younger sister, Emma, was only 15 when Grandma left. She cried for months, then hardened into someone I barely recognized, someone who built walls around her heart and never fully let anyone in again. And me, I stayed. I married my high school sweetheart, built a house on the edge of the family property, had 2 children, and tried to create new memories to replace the ones that hurt too much to revisit, but I never stopped missing her. I never stopped wondering what she'd meant by what was taken, and I never stopped hoping that one day I'd turn around and she'd be standing there, ready to explain everything. The call came on a Tuesday evening in late September. I was in my kitchen making dinner, my teenage daughter complaining about homework at the table, my son playing video games in the living room, the comfortable chaos of ordinary life humming around me. My phone rang with my father's number, and when I answered, his voice was strange, tight, and strained, like he was forcing words through a too small opening. "She called," he said without preamble. "Your grandmother. She's back in town. She wants to have dinner this Saturday. All of us. At the farmhouse." I stood there with a wooden spoon dripping tomato sauce onto the floor, unable to form a coherent response. My daughter looked up, concerned. "Mom, you okay?" I wasn't okay. I was 21 again, standing in the orchard, waiting for a woman who never came back. I was 41, a mother myself, facing the return of someone who'd been more myth than memory for half my life. "What did she say?" I finally managed. "Not much," Dad replied, and I could hear the old anger creeping back into his voice. "Just that she's staying at the Willowbrook Inn, that she's been back for a week getting things in order, and that it's time we all sat down together. She said there are things we need to know about the farm, things she should have told us a long time ago." The way he said things made my stomach clench. This wasn't going to be a simple reunion. This was going to be a reckoning. The days leading up to that Saturday dinner were surreal. The family group chat, usually quiet except for birthday wishes and the occasional shared recipe, exploded with messages. My uncle, who hadn't set foot in Tennessee in 15 years, booked a flight immediately. Emma, now a successful real estate agent in Nashville, responded with a single word: unbelievable. My father sent detailed instructions about timing and parking, as if organizing the logistics could somehow control the emotional storm brewing. My mother, who'd married into this family and had loved Grandma Ruth like her own mother, vacillated between excitement and anxiety, cleaning the farmhouse with an intensity that worried me. I tried to prepare my own children, explaining that their great-grandmother, whom they'd only seen in old photographs, was coming back after a very long absence. My daughter, perceptive and direct, asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Why did she leave, Mom? What was so important that she'd abandon everyone?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I had a feeling that Saturday night, in the farmhouse where 4 generations of Mitchells had gathered around the same oak table, we were finally going to learn the truth. And somehow, I knew with a certainty that made my hands shake that truth was going to change everything we thought we understood about our family, our land, and the woman who'd walked away from it all. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that makes Tennessee feel like a postcard. The sky was impossibly blue, the air crisp with the first real hint of cold, and the leaves on the old maples lining the farm's driveway had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. It was the kind of day Grandma Ruth used to call God's showing off weather, and the beauty of it felt almost cruel given the tension knotting in my chest. I arrived at the farmhouse early, ostensibly to help my mother with final preparations, but really because I couldn't stand waiting at home any longer. The farmhouse looked exactly as it always had, a 2-story white clapboard structure, with a wraparound porch and green shutters, surrounded by the gardens my grandmother had planted decades ago. My mother had cleaned it within an inch of its life. The windows gleamed, the porch had been swept, and inside, every surface shone. The dining room table, the massive oak piece that had been in the family since my great-grandfather's time, was set for 8 people, with my mother's good china and the cloth napkins we only used for Thanksgiving and Christmas. My father was in the barn, ostensibly checking on equipment but really hiding from his own emotions. I found him standing in the doorway, staring out at the fields, his shoulders rigid with tension. "You okay, Dad?" I asked, coming to stand beside him. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," he said finally, his voice rough. "I've been angry at her for 20 years. I've imagined this moment, what I'd say to her, how I'd make her understand what her leaving did to us. But now that it's actually happening, I just feel tired." I slipped my arm through his, and we stood there in silence. 2 people bound by blood and shared loss. waiting for a woman who'd been gone so long she'd become more symbol than person. Maybe we don't have to know what to feel yet, I offered. Maybe we just have to listen. He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that whatever explanation she offered couldn't possibly be enough to justify 2 decades of absence. My uncle arrived next, pulling up in a rental car with Colorado plates. I hadn't seen him in person in over 3 years, and the sight of him climbing out of the vehicle made my throat tight. He looked older, grayer, but his eyes were the same, carrying that particular sadness that had settled into them after Grandma left. We hugged on the driveway, holding each other longer than usual, drawing strength from the shared understanding that whatever happened tonight, we'd face it together. Emma showed up precisely on time, because Emma was always precisely on time, dressed in what I called her armor clothes, the expensive business suit and perfect makeup she wore when she needed to feel in control. She kissed my cheek, squeezed my hand, and I felt her trembling slightly despite her composed exterior. My husband had stayed home with the kids, understanding without me having to say it that this was something the Blood family needed to do alone. By 6:30, we were all gathered in the living room, 7 people arranged on furniture like actors waiting for a play to start, making stilted small talk that fooled no one. At exactly 7 o'clock, we heard the sound of tires on gravel. My mother's hand flew to her throat. My father stood up, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. Emma gripped the arm of her chair. My uncle moved to the window, then stepped back as if he'd seen something that burned. I was the one who walked to the front door. I don't know why it had to be me, but somehow it did. I opened it just as she reached the porch steps, and for a moment we simply looked at each other, grandmother and granddaughter, separated by 20 years, and a chasm of hurt that felt impossibly wide. She'd aged, of course. Her hair, which had been mostly brown with streaks of gray when she left, was now completely silver, cut short in a practical style. Her face had more lines, particularly around her eyes and mouth, but she stood straight and strong, and those eyes, the same warm brown I remembered, held mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. She was dressed simply in dark slacks and a cream-colored sweater, carrying a worn leather bag over one shoulder. She looked like someone who'd traveled a long distance, not just in miles, but in experience, and had finally arrived at a destination she'd been seeking for a very long time. "Sarah," she said, and her voice was exactly as I remembered it, low and steady with that slight Tennessee drawl that softened the edges of consonants. "My sweet girl, look at you." I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to demand explanations, to rage at her for the years of silence, to collapse into her arms like I was 7 years old again. Instead, I just stepped back and held the door open. "Everyone's waiting," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, took a deep breath as if steeling herself, and walked into the house she'd left 2 decades ago. The reunion, if you could call it that, was awkward and painful. My father stood frozen in the middle of the living room, unable to move forward or speak. My uncle's eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. Emma remained seated, her face a careful mask. My mother, bless her, moved forward and embraced Grandma Ruth, and I saw my grandmother's composure crack just slightly, her arms coming up to return the hug with a fierceness that spoke of deep regret. "I'm sorry," Grandma whispered, loud enough for all of us to hear. "I'm so sorry for the pain I caused, but I need you to understand that I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I loved you too much to let you inherit a lie." That sentence hung in the air like a thunderclap. "A lie? What lie?" My father found his voice. "What are you talking about, Mother? What lie?" She pulled back from my mother's embrace and looked around at all of us, her gaze moving from face to face, lingering on each of us as if memorizing features she'd only held in memory for so long. "Let's sit down," she said quietly. "Let's have dinner, and I'll tell you everything. I'll tell you about the farm, about what I discovered 20 years ago, about where I've been and what I've been doing. I'll tell you about the real history of this land, and why everything you think you know about our family's legacy is built on a foundation that was never ours to claim." She reached into her leather bag and pulled out a thick folder, the kind lawyers use, stuffed with papers and documents. She set it on the coffee table with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the room. "This," she said, tapping the folder, "is the truth. And once you know it, nothing will ever be the same. Dinner was a surreal experience, like trying to eat while sitting on a fault line you know is about to rupture. My mother had prepared a feast, the kind of traditional Southern meal Grandma Ruth used to make for Sunday gatherings. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans cooked with bacon, cornbread, and a pecan pie cooling on the counter. The food was delicious, but it might as well have been cardboard for all the attention we paid to it. We moved through the motions of passing dishes and filling plates, but the real focus was on the woman sitting at the head of the table, in the chair that had been empty for 20 years, and the folder she'd placed on the sideboard like a ticking bomb. Grandma Ruth ate slowly, deliberately, as if she was savoring not just the food, but the act of being here, in this room, with these people. She asked questions about our lives, gentle inquiries about my children, Emma's career, my uncle's life in Colorado. She listened to the answers with genuine interest, nodding and smiling in all the right places, but there was an undercurrent of sadness in her expression, as if each piece of news was another reminder of all the years she'd missed. My father barely touched his food. He sat rigid in his chair, his fork moving mechanically from plate to mouth, his eyes never leaving his mother's face. Finally, when my mother started clearing the main course plates, he set down his fork with a sharp click that made everyone jump. "Enough," he said, his voice tight. "I can't do this. I can't sit here and pretend this is a normal family dinner when you've been gone for 20 years, and you show up talking about lies and truth and foundations. Just tell us. Whatever it is, just say it." Grandma Ruth nodded slowly, as if she'd been waiting for this moment, expecting it. "You're right, Thomas. I'm sorry. I'm stalling because once I tell you, I can't untell you. Once you know, the farm, our history, everything changes." She stood up, retrieved the folder from the sideboard, and returned to her seat. She opened it carefully, revealing stacks of papers, some old and yellowed, others newer, official-looking documents with seals and signatures. 20 years ago, she began, her voice steady but soft. "I was going through some old family papers in the attic. Your grandfather and I were thinking about updating our will, and I wanted to make sure we had all the original property documents in order. That's when I found something that didn't make sense. A deed, very old, from 1889, with a name on it I didn't recognize, a name that wasn't Mitchell." She pulled out a fragile, brown-edged document protected in a clear plastic sleeve and laid it on the table. We all leaned forward. The handwriting was old-fashioned, elaborate, but legible. I could make out the date, the legal language, and there, in careful script, a name, Elijah Freeman. "Who is Elijah Freeman?" Emma asked, her professional instincts kicking in. She dealt with property records all the time in her real estate work. "According to this deed," Grandma said, "Elijah Freeman was the original owner of this land, all 200 acres. He purchased it in 1889 from the county for back taxes owed by the previous owner. He built a home here, farmed the land, raised a family, and according to every record I could find, he never sold it. It should have passed to his heirs." My uncle frowned. "But our great-great-grandfather, James Mitchell, he's the one who cleared this land and built the original farmhouse. That's the family story. That's what we've always been told." Grandma Ruth's expression was pained. "That's the story we were told, yes, but it's not the truth. James Mitchell didn't buy this land. He took it." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the old clock on the mantel ticking, the sound of wind moving through the trees outside, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "What do you mean, took it?" my father asked, his voice dangerous and low. Grandma pulled out another document, this one a newspaper clipping, also protected in plastic, dated 1891. The headline read, "Local Negro Farmer Dies in Barn Fire." The article was brief, written in the casual racism of the era, describing how Elijah Freeman, a colored man who'd been farming land north of town, had died in a tragic accident when his barn caught fire. He left behind a widow and 3 young children. There was no mention of what happened to the family after that, no follow-up article. Just a brief, dismissive paragraph about a man's death, his race mentioned as if it explained everything that needed explaining. "I spent 2 years researching," Grandma said quietly, "pulling out more documents, more evidence. I went to county records offices, historical societies, even traveled to archives in Nashville and Washington. I found Elijah Freeman's original land patent, his tax payments, records of his crop sales. He was a successful farmer, respected in the small black community that existed here before it was driven out. And then I found this. She laid out a legal document, a quitclaim deed dated 3 months after Elijah Freeman's death. It transferred the property from the estate of Elijah Freeman to James Mitchell for the sum of $1. It was signed with an X mark, supposedly the signature of Freeman's widow, witnessed by 2 white men, one of whom was the county clerk. She couldn't read or write, I said, understanding dawning with a sick feeling in my stomach. She probably had no idea what she was signing. Grandma nodded. If she even signed it at all. Quitclaim deeds like this were common in that era, a legal way to steal land from black families who had no resources to fight back in a system designed to exclude them. I found records showing that Elijah Freeman's widow and children left the area shortly after this deed was filed. There's a notation in a church record from a black congregation in Memphis, mentioning a Sister Freeman and her children, newly arrived from the country, in desperate need. After that, the trail goes cold. My father pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're saying our family, our legacy, is built on stolen land? That we've been living here, farming here, for 4 generations on property that was taken from a black family? His voice was rising, not in anger at Grandma, but in horror at the implication. That's exactly what I'm saying, Grandma Ruth replied, her voice breaking slightly. And when I discovered it, I couldn't live with it. I couldn't sit here every day, walk these fields, sleep in this house, knowing that it was built on theft and probably murder. That barn fire was no accident, Thomas. I found enough circumstantial evidence to believe that Elijah Freeman was killed so that his land could be taken, and our family, our beloved ancestor James Mitchell, was either directly responsible or complicit in that theft. The room erupted. My father was pacing, his hands in his hair, his face a mask of anguish. My uncle had his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. Emma was staring at the documents spread across the table as if they were contaminated. My mother stood frozen by the sideboard, one hand pressed to her mouth. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me, like everything solid had turned to quicksand. Our family history, the story we'd told ourselves about hard work and perseverance, about building something from nothing, was a lie. Worse than a lie. It was a theft, a violence, an erasure of another family's legacy so complete that until my grandmother went digging, we hadn't even known they existed. Why didn't you tell us? My father finally asked, stopping his pacing to face his mother. Why did you just leave? Why didn't you bring this to us 20 years ago so we could figure it out together? Grandma Ruth's eyes filled with tears, the first real crack in her composure. Because I was ashamed, she said, her voice raw. Because I didn't know what to do. Because when I tried to talk to your father about it, he got angry and told me I was stirring up trouble over ancient history that didn't matter anymore. He said we'd worked this land for generations, that it was ours by right of labor, even if the original acquisition was questionable. He told me to let it go, to stop digging into things that would only cause pain. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but I couldn't let it go. Every time I walked through that orchard, I thought about Elijah Freeman planting trees that my husband's grandfather claimed as his own. Every time I preserved food from this garden, I thought about the widow and children who were driven away with nothing. It ate at me, poisoned every moment of joy I tried to have here. So I left. I left because I couldn't be part of the lie anymore, but I also couldn't figure out how to make it right. Where did you go? I asked, my voice barely audible. What have you been doing all this time? She took a shaky breath and pulled out another section of documents from the folder. I went looking for them, for Elijah Freeman's descendants. I hired genealogists, worked with historical societies that specialize in African American family history, followed every lead no matter how thin. It took me 5 years, but I found them. Elijah and his wife, whose name was Clara, had 3 children. The eldest, a daughter named Ruth, that's who I'm named after. Though I didn't know the significance until I found her story, she survived to adulthood and had children of her own. The line continued, scattered across Tennessee, Arkansas, and eventually to Chicago during the Great Migration. She pulled out a photograph, more recent, showing a large extended family gathered for what looked like a reunion. This was taken 3 years ago. These are Elijah Freeman's descendants. There are 42 of them now, spread across the country. Teachers, nurses, a lawyer, a minister, a veteran, a whole beautiful family tree that grew despite everything that was taken from them. She pointed to a woman in the center of the photo, elderly but with a regal bearing, surrounded by what appeared to be children and grandchildren. This is Loretta Freeman Washington. She's Elijah's great-great-granddaughter, the family matriarch. I found her 12 years ago, living in Chicago. I introduced myself, told her who I was and what I'd discovered, and then I spent the next decade working with her and her family, trying to figure out how to make restitution for what was stolen. My father sank back into his chair, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. Restitution, he repeated. What does that mean? Are you saying we have to give up the farm? Grandma Ruth's expression was complicated, a mixture of determination and sorrow. I'm saying we have to make it right. The legal reality is complex. The statute of limitations on the original theft has long passed. There's no court that would force us to return the property now. But morally, ethically, we have an obligation. So I've spent the last 20 years doing two things. First, I worked. I took jobs, saved every penny, invested carefully. I built up a fund, a significant amount of money that represents what this land would be worth if Elijah Freeman's family had been able to keep it and pass it down through generations. She pulled out a bank statement, and I saw the number at the bottom. It was staggering, well over $1 million. Second, I worked with lawyers to create a legal framework for what I'm proposing, a way to acknowledge the theft, to make financial restitution, and to create a lasting partnership that honors both families' connection to this land. She pulled out the final document, a thick legal contract with multiple signatures. This is a proposal. The Freeman family and I have been negotiating it for 3 years, with the help of attorneys who specialize in restorative justice. Here's what it entails. We formally acknowledge that this land was stolen from Elijah Freeman and his heirs. We make a substantial financial payment to the Freeman descendants, divided equally among the current generation, and we create a joint stewardship arrangement for the farm itself. Emma, her lawyer instincts fully engaged now, reached for the contract. What does joint stewardship mean? Grandma Ruth explained. It means the farm stays in operation, but it's managed by a board that includes representatives from both families. Any profits are split. Any major decisions about the land's use require consensus. And most importantly, the history, the true history, is preserved and taught. We create a memorial to Elijah Freeman on this property. We tell his story. We make sure that what happened here is never forgotten or minimized. She looked around at all of us, her gaze steady despite the tears on her cheeks. I know this is overwhelming. I know it changes everything. But I couldn't come back, couldn't face you all, until I had a real solution to offer. Not just a confession of our family's sins, but a path toward making it right. The Freeman family has agreed to this proposal. Loretta and several of her relatives are willing to meet with us, to work together to build something new from this painful history. But I need you to agree, all of you, because this farm isn't just mine to give away. It belongs to all of us, and any decision about its future has to be made together. The weight of what she was asking settled over the room like a heavy blanket. She was asking us to give up not just money, but our entire understanding of who we were. She was asking us to share the land we'd thought was solely ours, to acknowledge that our prosperity was built on someone else's suffering. She was asking us to choose between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truth. And she was asking us to do it right now, in this moment, with the ghost of Elijah Freeman and the weight of 4 generations of injustice pressing down on us all. The silence stretched so long, it became painful. I watched my father, saw the war playing out across his face. This was the man who'd poured his life into this farm, who'd modernized it and made it profitable, who'd seen it as his inheritance and his legacy to pass down. Now he was being told that legacy was tainted, that everything he'd built was on a foundation of theft and violence. I watched Emma, always so practical and controlled, staring at the legal documents with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was she calculating the financial loss? Or was she, like me, feeling the ground shift beneath everything we'd believed about ourselves? My uncle had gone very quiet, his eyes distant, and I wondered if he was thinking about why he'd really left Tennessee all those years ago. Had some part of him always sensed that something was wrong with this place, even if he couldn't name it? And my mother, who'd married into this family and loved this land as if it were her birthright too, looked stricken, caught between loyalty to her husband and the moral clarity of what Grandma Ruth was proposing. I was the first to speak, surprising myself. "I want to meet them," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "The Freeman family. Before we make any decisions, I want to meet them and hear their story directly. I want to understand what this means to them, not just what it costs us." Grandma Ruth's face softened with something like relief. "They're here," she said quietly. "In Tennessee, I mean. Loretta and 3 of her children drove down from Chicago yesterday. They're staying at the same inn I am. They didn't want to impose on this dinner, didn't want to intrude on family processing, but they're willing to meet whenever you're ready. Loretta said she's waited this long. She can wait a little longer." The fact that they were here, so close, made everything suddenly more real. These weren't abstract descendants, names on a genealogy chart. They were real people who'd driven hundreds of miles to reclaim a piece of their history that had been stolen from them. "Tomorrow," Emma said suddenly, her voice crisp and decisive. "Can we meet them tomorrow? Because Dad's right. We can't just sit with this. We need to move forward one way or another." My father looked at his daughter, then at his mother, then down at his hands. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, and his voice cracked. "I don't know if I can sit across from these people and hear about what our family did to theirs. I don't know if I can give up this farm, even partially. This place is everything to me. It's all I have." "It's not all you have," Grandma Ruth said gently, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You have your family, your children, your integrity. And Thomas, listen to me. Keeping this farm the way it is now, knowing what we know, that would cost you more than any financial arrangement ever could. It would cost you your soul." He pulled his hand away, not angrily, but as if her touch burned. "You don't get to come back after 20 years and tell me about my soul, Mother. You don't get to abandon us, leave us to deal with Dad's death and the farm and everything else, and then waltz back in with this moral crusade and expect us to just fall in line." His voice was rising again, all the hurt and anger of 2 decades pouring out. "You want to make restitution? Fine. Use your $1 million. Give it to them. But don't ask me to give up my land, my livelihood, my children's inheritance because of something that happened over 100 years ago by people who are long dead." Grandma Ruth didn't flinch. "It's not just about what happened 100 years ago, Thomas. It's about what we do now. It's about whether we're the kind of people who perpetuate injustice because it benefits us, or whether we're the kind of people who do the hard, costly work of making things right." And yes, I left. I left because I was a coward who couldn't face this fight. But I'm back now, and I'm asking you, begging you, to be braver than I was. The conversation went in circles for another hour, voices rising and falling, tears shed, old resentments aired alongside new moral dilemmas. My uncle surprised everyone by saying he supported Grandma's proposal, that he'd never felt right about the farm anyway, and now he knew why. Emma remained non-committal, saying she needed to review the legal documents more carefully, but I could see her softening, her natural sense of fairness warring with her protective instincts toward our father. My mother finally spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "I think we should meet them. I think we owe them that much, at least. We owe them the courtesy of listening to their story and looking them in the eye. After that, we can decide what's right. But we can't make this decision in a vacuum, pretending they're not real people with real pain and real claims to this land." It was decided then, in that tentative way families make decisions when consensus is impossible, but forward motion is necessary. We would meet the Freeman family the next day, Sunday afternoon, here at the farmhouse. Grandma Ruth would arrange it. And then, after we'd heard them out, after we'd sat with the full weight of the history and the humanity involved, we would make a decision about the farm's future. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, I found myself alone with Grandma Ruth on the front porch. The night was cool and clear, stars brilliant in the country darkness, the sound of crickets and distant owls filling the air. "I missed you," I said simply, all the complicated emotions of the evening distilling down to that basic truth. "Every day for 20 years, I missed you." She pulled me close, and I rested my head on her shoulder like I used to when I was small. "I missed you too, sweet girl, more than you can know. There were so many times I almost came back, almost gave up on this quest, because the cost of being away from you all was so high. But every time I wavered, I'd think about Elijah Freeman's children, driven from their home, and I'd think about what kind of grandmother I wanted to be to you. Did I want to be the kind who taught you that comfort and convenience matter more than justice? Or did I want to be the kind who showed you, even at great personal cost, that doing the right thing is worth it? I pulled back to look at her face in the dim porch light. What if Dad won't agree? What if he refuses to go along with the restitution plan? She sighed, looking out at the dark fields. Then I'll give them my share, whatever legal claim I have to this property. I'll do what I can on my own. But I'm praying, Sarah. I'm praying that your father and all of you will see that this isn't about loss. It's about gain. It's about gaining back our integrity, our ability to look at ourselves in the mirror, our chance to be part of healing instead of perpetuating harm. That's worth more than any amount of land. Hey, I want to pause here for just a moment. I know this story is heavy, and maybe it's stirring up feelings about your own family, your own history, or injustices you've witnessed or experienced. If you're still with me, thank you. Your presence here, your willingness to sit with difficult truths, that matters. I'd love to know where you're watching from, what this story is bringing up for you. Drop a comment below. Tell me your thoughts. Share your own family stories if you feel moved to. And if this resonates, if you think someone else needs to hear it, please share it. Sometimes the most important conversations start with a story that makes us uncomfortable. Let's keep this conversation going together. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed next to my husband, who'd listened patiently to my rambling recap of the dinner, and then held me while I cried, and stared at the ceiling trying to process everything. My phone buzzed around 2 a.m. with a text from Emma. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about those kids, Freeman's children, losing everything. How do we live with this? I wrote back, I don't know, but I think Grandma's right. We have to try to make it right. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, Dad's going to fight this. You know that, right? He's going to see it as choosing strangers over family. I typed, maybe it's not about choosing. Maybe it's about expanding what family means. She didn't respond after that, but I knew she was awake, wrestling with the same questions I was. What did we owe to the past? What did we owe to people we'd never met but whose suffering had directly benefited us? And what did we owe to ourselves, to our own sense of who we wanted to be in the world? Sunday dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched the heaviness in my chest. I drove to the farmhouse early again, needing to be there before the Freeman family arrived, needing to walk the land with new eyes. I went to the orchard first, the one Grandma Ruth had loved so much, and stood among the old apple trees. How many of these had Elijah Freeman planted? Had he walked here with his children, teaching them the same lessons about patience and seasons that Grandma had taught me? I touched the rough bark of the oldest tree, a gnarled giant that had to be well over 100 years old, and I felt the weight of all that unacknowledged history pressing down. This tree had witnessed everything. It had seen Elijah Freeman's labor, had maybe even seen the night the barn burned. It had stood silent while his family was driven away, and while my family built their prosperity on stolen ground. I pressed my forehead against the trunk and whispered, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It felt inadequate, childish even, apologizing to a tree. But I didn't know what else to do with the grief that was rising in me, grief for people I'd never known, and for the innocence of my own family story that I could never get back. By noon, everyone had gathered again. The atmosphere was different from the night before, less shocked and more grimly determined. My father looked like he hadn't slept either, his eyes red-rimmed and his jaw set in that stubborn way I knew meant he'd made up his mind about something. Grandma Ruth arrived with a quiet dignity, dressed simply, carrying herself like someone about to facilitate a ceremony of great importance. At 12:30, we heard cars on the gravel drive. Through the window, I watched a large SUV and a sedan pull up and park. Car doors opened, and people emerged. My first thought was how ordinary they looked, and I immediately felt ashamed of the thought. What had I expected? They were a family, like any family, spanning generations. An elderly woman, who had to be Loretta, moved slowly with the aid of a cane, helped by a middle-aged man who was clearly her son. A woman about my age got out of the second car with 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl. Another man, older, with gray in his beard, emerged carrying a large portfolio case. They stood for a moment in the drizzle, looking at the farmhouse, and I tried to imagine what they were feeling. This was their ancestral land, the place their great-great-grandfather had built a life before it was violently taken away. Were they angry? Sad? Hopeful? Grandma Ruth went out to greet them, and I watched through the window as she embraced Loretta, the two elderly women holding each other with obvious affection. They'd built a relationship over the years, I realized. This wasn't just a transaction for Grandma. These were people she'd come to know and care about. They all came inside, shaking off rain, and suddenly the farmhouse felt full in a way it hadn't in years. Introductions were made, awkward and formal at first. Loretta Freeman Washington, her son Marcus, her daughter Denise, and Denise's children, Tyler and Jasmine. The older man with the portfolio was introduced as Dr. Raymond Freeman, a historian and a cousin who'd helped research the family history. We gathered in the living room, and for a moment, no one seemed to know how to start. Finally, Loretta spoke, her voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of age and wisdom. I want to thank you all for agreeing to meet with us. I know this is difficult. Ruth has told me how hard this has been for your family, learning this history. I want you to know that we don't come here with anger or demands. We come here with a desire for truth and healing. She looked around at each of us, her gaze lingering on my father. My great-great-grandfather, Elijah Freeman, was born into slavery in 1855, right here in Tennessee. He was 10 years old when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, but he didn't experience real freedom until after the war ended. He worked as a sharecropper for years, saving every penny, and in 1889, he did what was supposed to be impossible for a black man in the South. He bought land, 200 acres of good farmland that he could pass down to his children, that could be a foundation for generations of Freemans to build on. She paused, her eyes glistening. He farmed that land for 2 years. He built a house, a barn, planted an orchard. My great-grandmother Clara told stories about those years until the day she died. She said they were the happiest years of her life, the only time she'd ever felt truly free, truly safe. And then one night, the barn caught fire. Elijah ran in to save the animals, and he never came out. Clara always believed it was set deliberately, that there were men in the area who didn't want a black man to succeed, who saw his prosperity as a threat. But she couldn't prove it. And even if she could have, there was no justice available to her. Loretta's son Marcus took up the story. 3 months after Elijah died, white men came to the house with papers. They told Clara she had to sign, that there were debts that needed to be paid. She couldn't read, had no one to advise her, and she was terrified they'd harm her children if she refused. So she made her mark on the paper. Within a week, they were forced off the land with nothing but what they could carry. They ended up in Memphis, living in a single room, Clara taking in washing to feed her 3 children. The land, the house, the orchard, everything Elijah had built, was gone. Dr. Freeman opened his portfolio and pulled out photographs, documents, a family Bible with names and dates recorded in careful handwriting. This is what we've been able to piece together of Elijah Freeman's life: birth records, his marriage certificate, the original land purchase document, tax receipts showing he paid his obligations. And this, he laid out a photograph, old and faded, showing a black man standing proudly in front of a barn. This is the only photograph we have of Elijah. It was taken in 1890, a year before he died. That barn behind him, we believe, is the one that burned, and that land in the background is this land, the land we're standing on right now. I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph. Elijah Freeman looked directly at the camera with an expression of quiet dignity and unmistakable pride. He was wearing his best clothes, probably his only good clothes, and his hand rested on a fence post, as if claiming his place in the world. Behind him, the barn was sturdy and well built, and in the distance, I could make out the shapes of young trees that had to be the beginning of the orchard. This man had stood on this exact spot, had looked out at these same hills, had built something with his own hands that he believed would last for generations. And then, it had all been taken away. His life stolen, his family driven into poverty, his name erased from the land's history until my grandmother went digging. I felt my father shift beside me, and when I glanced at him, I saw that he was staring at the photograph too, his face pale and stricken. Whatever resistance he'd been building, whatever arguments he'd been preparing, seemed to crumble in the face of that image, that undeniable proof of a real man with real dreams who'd been destroyed so that our family could prosper. Denise, Loretta's daughter, spoke next, her voice steady but emotional. Growing up, we heard stories about the lost farm. It was part of our family mythology, this place that should have been ours, that was stolen. But it was abstract, you know? Just a story, like something from a history book. When Ruth found us, when she showed us the documents and told us she wanted to make restitution, it became real. This wasn't just history. This was our history, our family's stolen legacy. And suddenly, we had to decide what that meant to us, what we wanted to do about it. She looked at her teenagers, who were sitting quietly, taking everything in. I wanted my children to know this story, to understand that their ancestors were strong, capable people who built something from nothing, and then had it violently taken away. I wanted them to know that what happened to Elijah Freeman wasn't unique. It happened to thousands of Black families across the South, this systematic theft of land and wealth that created the racial wealth gap we still see today. But I also wanted them to see that healing is possible, that people can choose to do the right thing even when it's hard and costly. Tyler, the teenage boy, spoke up, his voice cracking slightly with adolescent uncertainty. When Grandma Loretta told us we might get to see the farm, the actual land our ancestor owned, I didn't know how I'd feel. I thought maybe I'd be angry, you know? But standing here, seeing the house and the fields, mostly I just feel sad. Sad for what was lost, for all the generations of our family who could have grown up here but didn't get the chance. And I guess I feel a little bit hopeful too, because you all are listening. You're not denying it or making excuses. That means something. His sister Jasmine nodded. I want to know what the orchard looks like, she said quietly. Great-great-great-grandpa Elijah planted apple trees. Are they still there? Can we see them? The question was so simple, so human, and it broke something open in the room. This wasn't about legal documents or financial restitution anymore. It was about a girl wanting to see the trees her ancestor had planted, wanting to touch something he'd touched, wanting to feel connected to a history that had been stolen from her family. Yes, I said, standing up before I could second-guess myself. Yes, the orchard is still there. Some of the trees are over 100 years old. They still produce apples every fall. I'd be honored to show you. I looked at my father, silently asking permission, and after a long moment, he nodded. We all went outside, a strange procession of two families bound together by theft and loss, and the fragile possibility of healing. The drizzle had stopped, and weak sunlight was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the orchard in that particular golden light that makes everything look both beautiful and melancholic. I led them down the path Grandma Ruth had walked with me so many times, past the garden, through the gate, into the rows of gnarled apple trees. Loretta moved slowly, leaning on her cane and her son's arm, but she was determined to walk the land herself. When we reached the oldest tree, the one I'd pressed my forehead against that morning, she stopped. She reached out with a trembling hand and touched the bark, her fingers tracing the deep grooves and rough texture. Elijah, she whispered, your trees are still here. Your trees are still bearing fruit. She pressed her palm flat against the trunk and closed her eyes, and I saw tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Her family gathered around her, all of them touching the tree, and I felt like we were witnessing something sacred, a reconnection across time and injustice, a family reclaiming a piece of their stolen heritage. My father stood apart, watching, and I saw his face working. Emotions he'd kept locked down for 20 years fighting their way to the surface. Finally, he walked over to Loretta. Mrs. Washington, he said, his voice rough. I'm Thomas Mitchell. This land, this farm, it's been my whole life. I've worked it since I was a boy, poured everything I have into it. When my mother told me the truth about how my family acquired it, I wanted to deny it, to find some way to make it not true. But standing here, watching you touch this tree that your ancestor planted, I can't deny it anymore. I can't pretend that my family's prosperity isn't built on your family's suffering. He paused, struggling to find words. I don't know how to make this right. I don't know if it's even possible to make it right, but I want to try. I want to find a way to honor Elijah Freeman's legacy and to give your family back what should have been yours. Loretta opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw a lifetime of pain and resilience in her gaze. Mr. Mitchell, she said gently, what was taken from my family can never be fully restored. Elijah is gone. The generations that should have grown up on this land are scattered. But what we can do, what we can build together, is a new legacy, one that acknowledges the past honestly and creates a future that honors both our families. That's what Ruth has been working toward, and that's what I'm asking you to consider. Not giving up your land, but sharing it. Not erasing your family's history, but expanding it to include the truth of ours. She reached out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, my father took it. They stood there in the orchard, two people from families bound together by violence and theft, choosing in that moment to try something different, to try healing instead of perpetuating harm. It wasn't a solution yet, wasn't a signed agreement or a legal resolution, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of denial and defensiveness, a small opening through which light could start to pour in. Grandma Ruth stood beside me, and I felt her hand slip into mine. "This is what I came back for," she whispered. "This moment right here. This is worth 20 years of waiting." We spent the rest of the afternoon in the farmhouse, gathered around the dining table that had witnessed so much family history, now witnessing the possibility of a new kind of family being forged. Dr. Freeman spread out his research, walking us through the documented history of Elijah Freeman's life and the systematic dispossession of Black landowners in the post-Reconstruction South. It was a history I'd never learned in school, a history that had been deliberately obscured and forgotten. He showed us maps indicating where thriving Black communities had existed in rural Tennessee, communities that were destroyed through violence, legal manipulation, and economic pressure. He showed us statistics about land loss, about the millions of acres that had been owned by Black families in 1900, and the tiny fraction that remained in Black ownership today. What happened to Elijah Freeman, he explained, was part of a larger pattern, a systematic campaign to prevent Black economic independence and to maintain white supremacy through control of land and resources. Understanding that context doesn't make what happened to any individual family less painful, but it helps us see that this wasn't just one bad act by one bad person. It was a system, and all of us, whether we realize it or not, are still living with the consequences of that system. Emma, who'd been quiet for most of the afternoon, finally spoke up. "I've been thinking about the legal framework Grandma proposed, the joint stewardship model. I've been researching similar arrangements, and there are actually precedents for this kind of restorative justice approach to land theft. There's a case in North Carolina where a white family and the descendants of formerly enslaved people who'd worked their land created a cooperative farming arrangement. There are indigenous land-back movements that have developed models for shared stewardship. This isn't unprecedented." She pulled out her laptop and showed us examples, case studies of other families and communities that had grappled with similar histories and found creative solutions. "What I'm seeing," she continued, her professional analytical mind fully engaged now, "is that the most successful arrangements are ones that don't try to simply reverse history or pretend the intervening generations didn't happen. Instead, they acknowledge the complexity, honor both families' connections to the land, and create something new that serves both justice and practical sustainability." She looked at the Freeman family. "What would you want this farm to be? If we move forward with a joint stewardship model, what's your vision for how it operates?" Marcus, Loretta's son, leaned forward. "We've talked about this a lot as a family. None of us are farmers. We've built lives in cities, have careers and homes elsewhere. We can't just move back here and take over operations, and honestly, that's not what we want. What we want is acknowledgement, financial restitution that recognizes the wealth that was stolen from our family, and a meaningful role in how this land is used going forward." He glanced at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "We'd like to see part of the land used for community purposes. Maybe a community garden that serves the local area, maybe educational programs about sustainable farming and historical preservation. We'd like to see Elijah Freeman's story told here, maybe a small museum or memorial, and we'd like to be partners in decision-making about the farm's future, to have a real voice rather than just being symbolic." Denise added, "We also want our children and grandchildren to have a connection to this place, to be able to visit and feel like they belong here, like this is part of their heritage too. That's worth more than any amount of money, that sense of belonging, of having roots in a place." My father listened to all of this, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke. "I need to be honest with you all. This is hard for me, really hard. I've spent my whole life believing that this farm was mine by right, that my family earned it through hard work and sacrifice. Finding out that foundation is built on theft, that my prosperity came at the direct expense of your family's suffering. It's shaken everything I thought I knew about myself and my place in the world." He looked at Loretta. "But I also can't unhear what I've heard today. I can't unsee that photograph of Elijah Freeman standing in front of his barn. I can't pretend that your family's claim to this land isn't as valid, more valid really, than mine. So I'm willing to move forward with the joint stewardship model. I'm willing to work with lawyers to create an arrangement that gives your family both financial restitution and a real stake in this farm's future. But I need time to process this, to figure out what it means practically. And I need to know that we're building something sustainable, not just making a symbolic gesture that falls apart in a few years." Grandma Ruth pulled out the detailed proposal she and the Freeman family had been developing. "That's exactly what we've been working on, Thomas. This isn't a quick fix or a symbolic gesture. This is a comprehensive plan that addresses financial restitution, legal ownership structure, operational management, and long-term sustainability. The financial component involves a significant payment to the Freeman descendants, funded partially by the money I've saved and partially by taking out a conservation easement on a portion of the land, which provides a tax benefit and ensures the land can never be developed." She walked us through the numbers, the legal structures, the proposed governance board that would include representatives from both families. The farm continues to operate as a working farm, generating income that's split between the families according to an agreed-upon formula. A portion of the land, maybe 20 acres, is set aside for the community garden and educational center that Marcus mentioned. We create a nonprofit organization to manage that component, with board members from both families and from the broader community, and we establish a memorial to Elijah Freeman, something permanent and prominent that tells his story and acknowledges the theft that occurred. It was comprehensive, thoughtful, and clearly the result of years of careful planning. As Grandma walked us through each component, I could see the resistance in my father's face gradually shifting to something else. Not quite acceptance, but maybe the beginning of understanding. "This would work," Emma said, her lawyer brain processing the details. "This is actually legally sound and operationally feasible. The conservation easement is smart. It provides immediate funding while protecting the land's agricultural character. The nonprofit structure for the community and educational components allows for grant funding and tax-deductible donations, and the governance board model ensures both families have real power, not just one family making token gestures toward the other." She looked at my father. "Dad, I think we should do this. I think this is the right thing to do, and I think it's actually the smart thing to do. It protects the farm's future, creates new revenue streams, and gives us a chance to be part of something meaningful, something that addresses a real historical injustice." My uncle, who'd been mostly quiet, spoke up. "I agree with Emma. I think this is our chance to break the cycle, to choose differently than our ancestors chose. And honestly, I think it's our only chance to keep this farm in the family long term. The agricultural economy is brutal. Small family farms are disappearing. But a farm with a mission, with community support, with multiple revenue streams and a compelling story that has a chance of surviving." He looked at the Freeman family. "I want to be part of this. I want to help build this new model. And I want my kids to grow up knowing that their family chose justice over comfort, chose honesty over convenient lies. One by one, we each spoke our piece. My mother, tears in her eyes, said she'd support whatever my father decided, but that her heart was telling her this was right. I talked about wanting my children to inherit not just land, but integrity, not just wealth, but wisdom about how that wealth was acquired and what responsibilities came with it. Even my husband, who'd come for the afternoon session, spoke about the importance of modeling moral courage for the next generation. The sun was setting by the time we'd worked through all the details, all the questions and concerns and practical considerations. The farmhouse was filled with the golden light of late afternoon, and there was a sense of something shifting, some fundamental reorientation happening in that room. My father stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the fields he'd worked his entire life, fields that would soon be shared, their story expanded to include truths that had been buried for over a century. "I need to say something," he announced, turning back to face all of us. "I need to say it to the Freeman family directly, and I need my own family to hear it too." He walked over to where Loretta sat and knelt down beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Mrs. Washington Loretta, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what my great-great-grandfather did to your great-great-grandfather. I'm sorry for the violence, the theft, the erasure of your family's legacy. I'm sorry that I've benefited my entire life from that theft, that I've built my sense of self and my prosperity on land that was stolen from your family. And I'm sorry that my first instinct when I learned the truth was to defend and protect what I had, rather than to immediately seek justice. His voice broke, and I saw tears streaming down his face. I can't undo what was done. I can't bring back Elijah Freeman or give your family the generations of wealth and stability that should have been yours. But I can choose, right now, to be part of making it right. I can choose to share this land, to honor your family's claim, and to work with you to build something new that acknowledges the past and creates a better future. And Loretta reached out and placed her hand on his head, a gesture that was both blessing and absolution. Thomas Mitchell, I accept your apology. I accept it on behalf of my family and in the spirit of my ancestor Elijah, who I believe would want healing more than vengeance. What happened to him? What happened to so many Black families? It was evil. But you are not your great-great-grandfather. You have a choice about what you do with the legacy you inherited, and you're making the right choice. That takes courage, and I honor that courage. She smiled, and it was a smile of such warmth and grace that it seemed to fill the room. Let's build something together. Let's create a legacy that both our families can be proud of, that honors the past honestly, and creates opportunities for the future. Let's show that healing is possible, that justice delayed doesn't have to be justice denied, and that people of goodwill can find a way forward even from the most painful histories. They embraced then, my father and this woman whose family had been so grievously harmed by his family, and it was one of the most powerful moments I've ever witnessed. It wasn't a Hollywood ending where everything was suddenly fixed. The pain was still there. The loss was still real. The generations of stolen wealth and opportunity couldn't be magically restored. But it was a beginning, a genuine moment of human connection across a chasm of historical injustice, and it gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way to something resembling justice. The practical work began immediately. Emma and Dr. Freeman started collaborating on the legal documents, working with the attorneys who'd helped draft the original proposal to customize it for our specific situation. My uncle volunteered to lead the effort to create the nonprofit organization that would manage the community and educational components. Denise and I started planning the memorial to Elijah Freeman, discussing what form it should take and where it should be located. We decided on a spot near the orchard, where visitors could see the trees he'd planted and read about his life and the theft of his land. Marcus and my father began talking about the operational aspects of the farm, how to integrate the Freeman family's vision with the practical realities of running a working agricultural operation, and Grandma Ruth, the woman who'd started all of this with her refusal to live with a lie, sat in the middle of it all with a look of profound peace on her face. Over the next few weeks, the plan took concrete shape. The legal documents were signed, the financial transfers were made, the conservation easement was established. The Freeman family received a substantial payment, divided among Loretta's children and grandchildren, money that represented at least a portion of what their family should have inherited if Elijah Freeman's land had been passed down through generations. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something real and meaningful. The governance board was established with 3 representatives from each family, and they began meeting regularly to make decisions about the farm's operations and future direction. The community garden was planned for the following spring, with input from local residents and agricultural extension agents. The educational center began to take shape, with plans for workshops on sustainable farming, historical tours focusing on both the Freeman and Mitchell family stories, and partnerships with local schools to bring students out to learn about agriculture and history. And the memorial to Elijah Freeman was designed, a beautiful stone marker with his photograph etched into it, surrounded by a small garden of native plants, with a bench where visitors could sit and reflect. The dedication ceremony for the memorial was held on a bright Saturday in November, almost exactly a year after Grandma Ruth had returned and blown up our family dinner with her revelations. Both families gathered, along with community members, local historians, and even a few journalists who'd gotten wind of the story. Loretta, now frailer but still sharp and present, spoke about her great-great-grandfather's dreams and the long journey her family had taken to reclaim this piece of their history. My father spoke about the difficulty of confronting painful truths and the importance of choosing justice over comfort. Grandma Ruth spoke about the 20 years she'd spent searching for a way to make things right, and her gratitude that she'd lived to see this day. But the most powerful moment came when Tyler and Jasmine, the teenage great-great-great-great-grandchildren of Elijah Freeman, planted an apple tree next to the memorial, a symbolic continuation of their ancestors' legacy. As they patted the soil around the young tree's roots, Tyler said, "This tree is for you, Grandpa Elijah. Your trees are still here, and now there's one more. We're still here too. They tried to erase us, but we're still here, and we're not going anywhere." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. After the ceremony, both families gathered in the farmhouse for a meal, and this time it wasn't tense or awkward. It was celebratory, full of laughter and storytelling, and the beginning of genuine relationships forming across the historical divide. Children from both families played together in the yard. Adults shared recipes and phone numbers and made plans for future visits. And in the middle of it all, Grandma Ruth sat with Loretta, two elderly women who'd become unlikely friends, who'd worked together to create something beautiful from something broken. In the months that followed, the farm became something neither family could have imagined on their own. The community garden flourished, with dozens of local families participating, growing vegetables and flowers, learning from each other, creating a space that belonged to everyone. The educational center hosted its first workshops, teaching sustainable farming techniques to aspiring young farmers and bringing school groups out to learn about agriculture, history, and the complicated legacy of land ownership in the American South. The memorial to Elijah Freeman became a pilgrimage site of sorts, with people from across the region coming to pay their respects and to learn about a story that had been hidden for so long. And the farm itself continued to operate and even thrive, with the joint stewardship model bringing new energy and ideas, while honoring the agricultural traditions that had sustained the land for generations. But perhaps the most profound changes were the ones that happened in hearts and relationships. My father, who'd been so resistant at first, became one of the most passionate advocates for the new model. He spent hours with Marcus, teaching him about the land and learning from him about the Freeman family's history and perspectives. He gave tours of the farm to visitors, telling both the Mitchell and Freeman family stories with equal weight, no longer hiding or minimizing the theft that had occurred, but presenting it as a painful truth that had to be acknowledged in order to move forward. Emma used her legal expertise to help other families grappling with similar histories, becoming something of an expert in restorative justice approaches to historical land theft. She wrote articles, gave presentations, and consulted with families and communities trying to address their own painful legacies. My uncle moved back to Tennessee, taking a leadership role in the nonprofit organization and finding a sense of purpose he'd been missing for years. And me, I found myself becoming the keeper of stories, the one who made sure that both families' histories were preserved and passed down. I started a project interviewing elders from both families, recording their memories and perspectives, creating an oral history archive that would ensure future generations understood not just what happened, but how it felt, what it cost, and what it took to begin healing. My children grew up knowing both families, understanding that their heritage was complicated, that they were the beneficiaries of both hard work and theft, and that they had a responsibility to be part of making things right. They played with the Freeman children when they visited, learned to tend the memorial garden, and absorbed lessons about justice and integrity that I hoped would shape the people they'd become. Grandma Ruth lived for 3 more years after the memorial dedication, long enough to see the farm transformation take root and flourish. In her final months, when she was too weak to walk the land anymore, we'd bring her photographs and tell her stories about what was happening, about the community garden's harvest, about the students who'd visited the educational center, about the deepening friendships between the families. She'd smile and nod, and sometimes she'd say, "It was worth it." Every lonely year, every hard moment, it was worth it to see this. She died peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning, and we buried her in the family cemetery on the farm, but not before the Freeman family asked if they could bury Elijah Freeman's memorial stone nearby, creating a symbolic reunion of the two people who'd been connected to this land across the chasm of time and injustice. At her funeral, Loretta spoke, her voice strong despite her age and grief. Ruth Mitchell was a woman of extraordinary courage. She could have lived out her life in comfort and ignorance, benefiting from stolen land without ever acknowledging the theft. Instead, she chose the harder path. She chose truth over. In the months that followed, the farm became something neither family could have imagined on their own. The community garden flourished, with dozens of local families participating, growing vegetables and flowers, learning from each other, creating a space that belonged to everyone. The educational center hosted its first workshops, teaching sustainable farming techniques to aspiring young farmers, and bringing school groups out to learn about agriculture, history, and the complicated legacy of land ownership in the American South. The memorial to Elijah Freeman became a pilgrimage site of sorts, with people from across the region coming to pay their respects and to learn about a story that had been hidden for so long. And the farm itself continued to operate and even thrive, with the joint stewardship model bringing new energy and ideas while honoring the agricultural traditions that had sustained the land for generations. But perhaps the most profound changes were the ones that happened in hearts and relationships. My father, who'd been so resistant at first, became one of the most passionate advocates for the new model. He spent hours with Marcus, teaching him about the land and learning from him about the Freeman family's history and perspectives. He gave tours of the farm to visitors, telling both the Mitchell and Freeman family stories with equal weight, no longer hiding or minimizing the theft that had occurred, but presenting it as a painful truth that had to be acknowledged in order to move forward. Emma used her legal expertise to help other families grappling with similar histories, becoming something of an expert in restorative justice approaches to historical land theft. She wrote articles, gave presentations, and consulted with families and communities trying to address their own painful legacies. My uncle moved back to Tennessee, taking a leadership role in the nonprofit organization and finding a sense of purpose he'd been missing for years. And me, I found myself becoming the keeper of stories, the one who made sure that both families' histories were preserved and passed down. I started a project interviewing elders from both families, recording their memories and perspectives, creating an oral history archive that would ensure future generations understood not just what happened, but how it felt, what it cost, and what it took to begin healing. My children grew up knowing both families, understanding that their heritage was complicated, that they were the beneficiaries of both hard work and theft, and that they had a responsibility to be part of making things right. They played with the Freeman children when they visited, learned to tend the memorial garden, and absorbed lessons about justice and integrity that I hoped would shape the people they'd become. Grandma Ruth lived for 3 more years after the memorial dedication, long enough to see the farm transformation take root and flourish. In her final months, when she was too weak to walk the land anymore, we'd bring her photographs and tell her stories about what was happening, about the community garden's harvest, about the students who'd visited the educational center, about the deepening friendships between the families. She'd smile and nod, and sometimes she'd say, "It was worth it. Every lonely year, every hard moment, it was worth it to see this." She died peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning, and we buried her in the family cemetery on the farm, but not before the Freeman family asked if they could bury Elijah Freeman's memorial marker nearby, creating a symbolic reunion of the 2 people who'd been connected to this land across the chasm of time and injustice. At her funeral, Loretta spoke, her voice strong despite her age and grief. Ruth Mitchell was a woman of extraordinary courage. She could have lived out her life in comfort and ignorance, benefiting from stolen land without ever acknowledging the theft. Instead, she chose the harder path. She chose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and in doing so, she gave both our families a gift we can never fully repay. She gave us the chance to heal. I stood at my grandmother's grave after everyone else had left, my hand resting on the cool marble stone, and I thought about the question she'd asked herself 20 years ago when she first discovered the truth about our land. What kind of grandmother did she want to be? What kind of legacy did she want to leave? She could have chosen silence, could have buried the documents and lived out her days in the farmhouse she loved, surrounded by family, comfortable in the lie. But she'd chosen differently. She'd chosen to be the kind of grandmother who taught through action, who showed that integrity matters more than inheritance, who demonstrated that it's never too late to choose justice even when the cost is high. And because of that choice, because of her courage, and her 20-year quest to make things right, 2 families were healing. A stolen legacy was being restored. and a piece of land that had witnessed so much pain was becoming a place of reconciliation and hope. I placed a single apple blossom on her grave, picked from one of Elijah Freeman's trees, and I whispered, "Thank you, Grandma. Thank you for showing us the way home." The story doesn't end here, of course. The work of reconciliation and restorative justice is ongoing, complicated, sometimes frustrating, always requiring patience and grace, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. There are still hard conversations, still moments of tension, when old wounds resurface, or when practical decisions force us to navigate competing interests and perspectives. The Freeman family and my family don't always agree on everything. We're still learning how to be partners, how to share power and decision-making, how to honor both our connections to this land, without erasing the fundamental difference in how we came to be connected to it. But we're doing the work. We're showing up, listening to each other, choosing relationship over righteousness, choosing healing over being right, and slowly, season by season, harvest by harvest, we're creating something new, something that neither family could have built alone. Last fall, on the anniversary of Elijah Freeman's death, we held a ceremony at the memorial. Both families gathered, along with community members and friends, and we told his story. We spoke his name. We acknowledged what was taken from him and from his descendants. And then we celebrated what was being built in his honor, the community garden bearing fruit, the educational center teaching a new generation, the farm thriving under shared stewardship. Tyler, now in college studying agricultural science, spoke about his plans to return to the farm after graduation, to be part of its future, in a way his ancestors were denied the chance to be. My daughter, standing beside him, talked about the oral history project she was helping me with, about the importance of preserving both families' stories so that the truth would never be buried again. And as I looked around at the faces gathered there, black and white, young and old, connected by blood and by choice, by history and by hope, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt whole.